This is a recording for the CUPHAT project. My name is Chris McCann. Today is the 6th of June 2023 and I have with me here Aideen Parker. Thank you, Aideen. Can you confirm for the recorder that you are happy to take part in this project?
I am happy to take part with Chris in this project.
And could you spell your name for the recorder,
Yep,
please?
Aideenparker.
Excellent. Okay, so maybe to start with, I'll ask you perhaps when you first moved, because obviously you're from Wexford originally. What were your early memories of arriving here in Rathdrum and moving here?
Okay, I moved from Wexford to Dublin in 1980. Spent 3 years in Carysford Training College, which was a convent-run training college. I moved from Dublin then down to Wicklow simply because I got a job. Jobs were very, very scarce. I did 3 interviews the one day, one in Tara Hill in Gorey, one in Horswood in Campile, and one in Rathdrum. And the priest from here rang my house before I got home and offered me the job, and I took the job. And the following day I got the other 2 jobs, but my father said to me, no, you're taking that, you honour that, blah blah. I can remember the day I did the interview being parked in a car straight outside the school, and all that went up and down were tractors. That's all that went up and down, and very little traffic, very little movement. So when I moved here, it was, I suppose at the time, like there were 7 pubs, there was a bank, and there was the beginnings of a very big pharmaceutical company out, it was Shearing Plough at the time, out on the Glendalough Road. So you had students from the universities on placement out there, so it was fairly active. Plus there was, Avondale had a forestry school out in Avondale, Coillte. They were still the Irish Forest Board at that stage. So from an outsider's point of view, there was a big glut of outsider people just like me, young, all that kind of thing. And then, but for the people themselves, there had been very little movement within the town because Rathdrum would be a garrison town. So historically it would, go back to very little movement. It had been the principal town in Wicklow a number of decades back, but it had been superseded then by Wicklow Town and Archaeological. But it was an exceedingly rural town with a history of really poverty and deprivation. Really, there was very, very little. People didn't settle here. Just the people who were here. There was also an orphanage here, and there was a special school at the time. And the community college was housed in that beautiful building, which was down on the main street. It was like an old period house, Comerford's. It was a small it was a vocational school, but most of the people went to secondary school in Wicklow or Archaeological. But when I started teaching here then, there was all the mammies weren't working. They were all minding their kids. I can remember that well. But not just in Rathdrum, but in Ireland at that time in the 1980s, there was depression. There was very little money. The place was exceedingly old-fashioned. I remember a lovely phone box right stuck in the middle of the square, just off the square, and the queues up at it because nobody had telephones. And in school here, we had no fridge, we had no phone, we had no nothing. So if anyone fell, you just fixed them, or you went off to the doctor with them. It was strange. It was and it was exceedingly rural. I think it's because kind of, if you think about it, Wicklow's on the coast, Archaeological on the coast, and Rathdrum is like a triangle in there. And it was kind of almost the last post or something before you went out into the barrenness of Glenmalure, Knockanana, Ockavana, all that kind of a way. So yeah, and I suppose one thing that was amazing about it at that time, that there was a train station, and there was even talk back then, that was in the 80s, that the train station would be bypassed, that it would go, because it was a sort of, and not being disingenuous to it, it was kind of a sleepy, quiet, very, very rural place, and yet you had this group of outsiders that were buzzing young people, there were. And it was a lovely place to be at that time because we were all the same age, early 20s and that kind of thing. But no one seemed to stay. There was a huge turnover of staff. There was a local priest here, and he had an affiliation to Clare and the West Coast. So all the teachers that came were from the West Coast, Clare, Galway, down to Kerry, Cork. And then they would come for so long and then they'd be gone again. And then I suppose a few started to settle. My own husband was science, so he was on placement out and that's how we met. I would have met him fairly early on then, and at the time I remember when we were deciding to get married and that, to buy a house, someone said, "You're looking in Rathdrum." We were saying, "But you're so handy to us," and it was lovely back. It was really, and there was 3 houses for sale in Rathdrum, and we eventually bought our house, which is on the Avondale estate, out there. But no, Rathdrum was it was untouched, and but there was even at that time there was a huge local community unity amongst the people, and it was kind of, other places didn't matter so much. It was almost, it was remote in every sense. Let me think what else about it. At the time, of course, there was a lot of, the employment was so Shearing Plough, the pharmaceutical company. Then there was the schools as employers. There was Quilch of them as the timber industry was massive in the area, and you had foresters and the forestry training school and that as well. And that was the main livelihood. People didn't really travel so much out of the area to work, and there was no private housing developments at all. The house we bought was a forester's house. It was a Board of Works house, as it would have been replicated all over the country. The same with the, what do you call that roof? I can't remember the name of the roof. It's not a tea roof, it's but after that there was nobody, there was no schemes of houses, no interest in it, because we were too far from Dublin, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and nearly like alone to yourself out here, There was no such thing as guards stopping for for drink or anything like that. You could do what you like, but it always had that lovely, I loved it from day one. There was something about it, and I was brought up in a town and then on to Dublin, but it was something so rural, and everyone knew everything about you, but you didn't care. I didn't care about things like that. I can remember one day actually being up at school, and I wasn't long married at the time, and the postman came and he said to me, "I left a card out in your house from America." My sister was in America on holidays and had sent me a postcard. So it was that rural, that people, "I left a card out in your house this morning, came from America." And you wouldn't have seen that in towns even at that stage. But it was always a very quaint, happy place, I would call it, and great mixing between, I suppose I got involved between school, and then I was involved in Vincent de Paul when I was in Dublin anyway, but I got involved in that, so I very, very quickly got to know people, and I never felt any pressure from a professional point of view from living here. Never, ever, ever, ever. People always respected that, so I was able to go out and be involved in things, and yet I wasn't compromised work-wise, which was lovely.
And what year did you move here?
1983.
How old were you then?
20.
What would you mentioned the 7 pubs in those days. What activities would have been available for someone who's 20
at that time, the edifice, we'll call it, of a building, the sports complex had been built during the last of the 70s, and that was a centre of attraction, the GAA. So I can remember tea parties, fundraising tea parties, mayoral, MAYORAL elections, so you'd be the mayor of the town, the mayor of Rathdrum, and you'd have fundraising things out there. And then the GA, anything that happened kind of happened out there, because when I came, there had been a hotel on the main street called Barry's, which is opposite Jacob's Pub. That was gone when I came. That's now a car sales room, it was. And there had been another hotel down at the railway station That was a kind of a Great Southern, somehow owned that, whatever. That was gone. So then you had and the pubs, and at that time, you see, music was big, and music was quite big around here. So you had kind of trad sessions going on in some of the pubs a lot of the time. And after that, then out in the sports complex, like we used to play squash and badminton, and that's basically kind of what you did. And you had walking, and then you were so near Wicklow or Archaeological. I would have been used to in Wexford. We didn't, we would always have gone sea swimming. And I mean, I know British Bay is nice, but they wouldn't compare to the beaches in Wexford. But we had to put up with that. And then you were so near, and for me from Wexford, I could get into the car and drive home in an hour, and I could into the car and drive to Dublin and be well in, whatever, in an hour. It was so central to everywhere, so.
Perhaps we'll touch on your childhood down in Wexford then. What are maybe the differences between what you remember from your childhood versus living in a place, like obviously in the seaside in Wexford, versus living in the mountains here?
Yeah. To this day, and I'm out in Avondale now, 500 acres behind, literally my garden, there's a wall, and there's a gap in the wall that was when we bought it, and the gap was left, and I'm in the Avondale estate, so the trees and everything, and I loved all that. But water, because in Wexford, I suppose my grandfather, my grandfather, that was kind of Rosslare Harbour. Then he was a station master, and he retired to Rosslare Strand. And literally his house is here, and the beach is just up at the gate. And we would have spent all of our lives in the water, whatever. And if you go down to Wexford town, no matter what street you come up or come down, you're looking at the water. The water is everywhere. And it was the one thing here that I used to say to myself, what is missing, and it's water. And I noticed that anytime, even my kids would remark it now, when I would go into Archaeological or Wicklow to do the shopping or the dentist or the doctor or whatever, I'd always have to come home by the water, just have a little look and come on. And the lake doesn't mean anything to me. It's the sea and the expansive water, But I suppose where I grew up in Wexford town, it was just a little bit outside the town. There was just a scheme of 26 houses out on their own, kind of. And it was fairly rural enough in the sense that we went blackberry picking up in the fields up to the church, and behind us then there was kind of a folly and a waterfall, and then there was a main row, a Duncannon line we call it, and then we were up, and the golf club was up there. My father was very involved in the golf club, so we would have spent a lot of our youth finding golf balls up in the golf club. That's what, on Saturdays, down fishing in the river, and up in the fields, that kind of thing. So it wasn't as if we were in the centre of a town, kind of. We were in Wexford town, but it was sort of rural. But then, and I suppose where I lived, the place name would be Clonard in Wexford now, which is very developed now. But we also then had a connection. My father had businesses, and he had a shop he was fabric, that's what he did, and he had one in Carlow and one in Wexford and one in Arklow, and we had lived a bit in Carlow for a while as well, during the summers and that, and which I found stifling. I couldn't get out to the sea, and at one stage I think my parents were thinking that they would move, because Carlow was booming then. You had the sugar factory and all that, and the land in Carlow is very, very rich in that. But we were sort of saying, no, we couldn't, none of us could bear it, because we were so far away from the water. It's strange, it's it's almost part of your psyche or something that you're like that. But no, I suppose coming to Rathdrum then was, if you were cynical, you would have said it was kind of insular. It was very, everyone knew you, everyone knew your business, everyone knew anything about it. But that never bothered me. I didn't care about anything like that. That didn't matter to me. And no, I adapted, completely. Where I lived in Wexford, you could walk everywhere. Here, you had to take a car everywhere. That's just was the nature of it, because everything was far away. shops, everything, you know.
And on that note, did people travel a lot, either by car or...
Nothing like they do today. I mean, like today you hear people kind of, running in and out to Arklow every day. No way, back when I started here. The train, I travelled up and down, that's how I got, when I went home for a weekend, I went on the train. If I was going to Dublin, I went on the train. And then I started in September and I bought a car in January. And you didn't have to do them 12 lessons, or you just got in and drove from the garage, like whatever way you did. But even then with your car, I was only thinking when I was saying, can I remember back in 1983, and I think my salary was about just hitting about £290 a month. And I bought my first car in that January, and I think it was £1,800, RZV 796. It was a Toyota Starlet, I'll never forget it. And I bought it in Finns and Gorey. But rent at that stage was £22 a month. So even petrol and running your car, it was a major expense on you. But you didn't have any option really being here. If you wanted to, I remember that in the community colleges in Arklow and Wicklow, they used to do courses and that. Or then we were affiliated with the Blackrock Teacher Centre, which you couldn't do anything like that unless you had a car. Wasn't as, do you know? So, but then again in Wexford, we used to cycle everywhere. We cycled to school, or we walked to school, and that's some difference now. Back when I started in Rathdrum, all the kids walked to school. There was a school bus, and then the kids walked to school after that. Very few came by car. Today, there's a room, that car park that couldn't hold what cars are coming. So things have changed like that. And I mean, the buses and the trains, and the buses are not real frequent, but they do come through about 3 times a day. But they're not overused. The train is not overused. It's not. It's very much used by people who have moved in, who are commuters. My own daughter now in college, she's on the train every day. So she's down at the 7:10 train, and she's home then. Because I mean, there's now 4 options coming home in the evening, which is fabulous. And it's dirt cheap, about $3.70 up and down, It's very, very cheap. But
and would there be many commuters living in this town?
Oh, absolutely today? Now. I mean, if I go down at 7 in the morning with her, so about 5 to 7, it's full. You won't get any parking down there. And then there's a train comes in at, I think, say 1 at 5:30, 1 at 6:30, 1 at about 7:30, and there's one I think at 8:30, or in around those times. The 5:30 one will be packed. The 6:30 one will be absolutely jammers. Now they would also be people not just living in Rathdrum, but kind of Ockram, Avoca, Gleneely, just all around about. But there's an awful lot of, I notice it now with driving with her. She's 4 years in college, and now in comparison to 4 years ago, it's the same people. The people who have bought houses here now. You can see it. Do you know what I mean? And she has met several of them as well, and you have a lot of them commuting, using the train. The car parking facilities aren't great, but it's It's a great way to try. It's great to be able to use it. And not like the train in Wexford we used to laugh when we were kids, because my as I say, we would have connections to Rossler Strand and Rossler Harbour, and if you're not from down there, people think there's just one Rossler, but there's very distinctively 2. Rossler Strand is where my grandparents retired to, ran a B&B. My grandmother ran a B&B, and Rossler Strand would be sort of posh. And people had second homes down there. Dublin people would have had second homes, and it was kind of vibrant. I used to always think it was the saddest place, because in the summer you couldn't get up or down it, and people eating ice creams, and then the minute September would come, everything would just close down until next Easter. It just literally shut, and you wouldn't see a sinner anywhere. Whereas Rossler Harbour is more the industrial end of things. You had the huge port and all that. And but we used to laugh because the English and the French ferries would be coming in and out there. They do Cherbourg and Le Havre, and then they do Pembroke and Fishguard, and the train would pull out of the station as the boat would be pulling in. No synchronisation between the arrival of the... So you'd have all these people coming in from the UK and France, and they would literally be docking, and the train would pull off, heading up the way. And it's still the same. Bizarre. Absolutely bizarre. Yeah.
I can imagine it actually. Perhaps then, while we're sort of in this on the geographical area of Wexford, perhaps if you could tell me, what are your favourite childhood memories about growing up in Wexford?
What did I write down? I wrote down a few little bits and pieces. I suppose I was lucky in the sense that my mother or father. My father was from a place called Strabberley in Laois, very rural country. My mum, her father was from Rossler Harbour, her mother was from Blackline in Cavan, and she had a lot of connections back up there. And because he was a station master, he was posted all over the place. So she spent some of her childhood in a place called Wellington Bridge, beautiful, out in the middle of the sticks, but it had a railway station, coming from Rossler Harbour across and onto Waterford through Wellington Bridge. That line, of course, they closed now they want to reopen it. And then he was transferred from Wellington Bridge to Abbeyleix, and up there. So my mother and father had a great, they weren't Wexford town people and all the rest. My father worked for Irish woolen mills in Portlaoise, and then he was transferred down to Wexford. Fine Wool Fabrics had a huge big plant in Wexford, and he went in there as a manager, and he worked there. But he was a very kind of an innovative man, very steady, very he was a really lovely man, died quite young, like he was just 60. But my mother was a very unusual, she's 86, very earthy woman, very... So as children, there was 6 of us, and everyone else where we lived had beautiful sitting rooms, and my mother had turned ours into... it was almost like an art workshop. She used to put wallpaper down on the ground, I can remember so clearly, and paint the bottoms of our feet, and we'd be walking along making footprints, and she loves art and that, and she used to bring us to Fort Mountain, if you ever heard of it, and used to go out there with sketch pads, I can remember very clearly, and we'd be spend a day, we'd all have our bare feet and bananas and that kind of thing, and sketching. We like when I look back at my childhood, we'd a really, real simple, happy. My father at work. My mother worked with the ESB before she got married. Then she couldn't. She didn't work. My father then worked in Fine Wool Fabrics, and then went on to do his own businesses and that and that. But we'd a very carefree kind of bringing up, and my mother really saw. Yeah, she had a different bend on the world than a lot of mothers of her era. She was very respectful and all that kind of thing, but she definitely thought differently to other people, and now I see it. She's 86 now, and there's not a bother on her, and she thought differently and kind of made us think differently, be very tolerant of people, and you accept everyone as they are. And she used to always use the word, make sure you're kind today in school. That's the one thing, and I would bring that with me even to here now, about kindness. She was whatever, but she didn't bend to kind of the rules and regulations. And if she got up in the morning, it was a lovely sunny day, she'd pack the whole lot of us in the car and off to Carlow for the day. Didn't give a hoot about the dinner or the house or anything, and we spent the whole day just having fun, building castles and out in the water, and she's teaching us to swim. And then I remember I suppose when I think of childhood as well, I think of other houses kind of. I remember them getting freezers and that, but my mother was always into homemaking, and I remember homemade soup, and we'd have rice and semolina and tapioca, and she used to have long forks, and we'd sit in front of the fire with a slice of bread on it and butter it on your knee. I can remember the marshmallows melting or whatever, and we used to be so jealous because the bread man, at that stage, like, you had a vegetable man, a butcher, a milkman, and a bread man used to deliver. That's the way people did it then. But we never got bread or anything from the bakery because my mother made all her own bread, you know, and we used to be so jealous. And they'd have ham in packets, and we never saw, you know, she was very earthy, making, I remember she used to, at tea time, cook us things like, I mean, you wouldn't even touch it now. Tripe, if you probably never heard of it. Yeah?
Oh, yeah.
I remember it.
My mother can remember it.
Yeah.
Having tripe.
Yeah, and oxtail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and those kind of foods. And canary pudding. I can remember, and she'd throw together scones, and when we'd come home from school, I can still see wet cold days and we'd be drowned with wet. You know, there'd be no heating or anything like that. And she'd have us all stripped off.
No, that's okay. Perhaps I might ask a different question then. Going back to Rathdrum, you've spoken about what it was like in the 80s. What are the big changes that you've seen in this town and in this sort of wider area?
So I'll say 20 years ago, for the first time ever, there was the first private housing estate, and that brought people in, which was really lovely. It kind of opened up things a little bit, you know, it made it different. Then the local hospital here, run by the nuns, I can't remember the order of nuns, it's an unusual name, the Divine Sisters of someone or other. But they had some connection with a place in India called Kerala, and a little village outside Kerala, and nurses started arriving and their children started arriving here, and for the first time ever we had started this cultural, you know, and children not of indigenous to the area arriving, and it really, really enhanced the place and I saw it 20 years ago beginning to open, stretching out a bit. And then I think that an influx of, I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with what was here, but an influx of young teachers changed the path of education in the place and began to, like we in 1999, well, I suppose I came out at a time in 83 where this 1973 curriculum was revolutionary. So I was trained in the 1973 curriculum, which for the first time ever, and they still talk about it, was contained in two orange books. I have them on my shelf at home. Curriculum na Bunscoil it's called. And it was child-centred. So you had this group of, I mean, school and the church and the pubs are central to a small little place like this. So school, I saw more so, rather than the schools I went to in Wexford, schools in this area were far more influential, or maybe you could see their influence more clearly on the population than I would have seen in Wexford town, because school was somewhere you went to and you came out of, whereas school was kind of integral, and no matter what was happening in the town, you know, when there was a Patrick's Day parade, we were part of it. When they were doing GA coaching, they were coming in to tell us when the training was on. When there'd be anything that would be going on, and it'd be the school as well. Then we'd be trotting down to the church and, you know, all that kind of thing. So the links were very, very evident that you would not get in an urban setting. And I suppose, what was the question you asked me, Chris? Yeah, what the difference?
Changes,
yeah, the changes. So I personally think that it kind of in the primary school sector, because we were teaching to the new curriculum, and then kind of the next curriculum came in 1999, and that was even more revolutionary. And the word, even though we had been doing it, differentiation came in, and it started talking about this inclusion and everything. And so therefore parents and teachers became closer, and we were able to talk about kids that had difficulties and that kind of thing, and encourage them in a different way and that kind of thing. And people saw that they may have had negative connotations about school, but their children were experiencing something much more positive, and that this encouraged them to encourage their children to go on. And I suppose the result of it was that the secondary schools started expanding until 30, it would be about 1990, 1990-ish maybe a little bit, 87, 8. The new community college was, the first phase was built because there was more kids staying at school because they had a better experience in primary, and now they were getting educated. And I would have noticed kind of where when I came here first, most of the kids, third level, it wasn't even on the radar. Now suddenly, like within about a 10-year period, by the 90s, education started taking on a much more positive role, and kids engaged more, and they started, and now third level suddenly became within their reach, and a lot of our pupils who would have come from backgrounds where education wasn't their parents hadn't had third level, they started going on, and it started changing the face of the thing. Then some of them came back and started building houses and settling here, because at the same time, like where Avondale didn't develop at all, and in fact, if anything, took a retrograde step over the last 20 years. The forestry school finished, training for forestry went to UCD, and the kind of Coillte had taken over, and for a little bit they spent a bit of money down there, and then it kind of fizzled out and there was no investment in it. The chemical factory boomed. It eventually went in 2015. It closed down, then it was taken over by someone else, but whatever. So certainly so you had one section of people that started going into third level. You had other kids then that were finishing school, and suddenly there was kind of apprenticeships out there, you know, like fitters and electricians and mechanics, and then you had operators' job, and they were well paid. They were very, very, and really treated well by shearing plough. And so over, how long am I here now? 40 years. I'd say the first 10 years was quite impoverished. The next 10 it started to develop a bit, and then say 20 years ago you had these kids now who, you know, had grown into men of 30 and that kind of thing, and girls of that age, and they had their families and they wanted more and they saw more and they were better paid, and they and then you started seeing housing development and that kind of thing. You know, so certainly things changed. And then I suppose you had moving on then to the Celtic Tiger, and things really became accessible, and to the point now where I often hear kids saying I'm going to Archaeological teach at Stephen to McDonald's. Would have been unheard of that you got into your car 30 years ago and drove to Archaeological to McDonald's. It just would have been unheard of. You went once a week to do your shopping. That was the extent of it. But you know, the cinema and, you know, that kind of thing. So certainly I suppose the town has opened up and become much more affluent on it, but I think it's because there is now this new mix of people coming in, and they're bringing with them a lot into the town, but they're also looking for more out of the town. And some people you'd sort of think would say, oh, what about all the whatever. I think it can only do good. I see what it has done to here. Like, we have such an eclectic mix now throughout, all different backgrounds. We're still a Catholic school, but we have children of non-Catholic and no ethos, and that's fine too. But they're all integrated part of, but we're still. You were here last week. We had an incidental inspection, and afterwards the inspector said to me, despite the fact that you've embraced everything, you're still very much a traditional rural school. And she said, I can feel it and I can see it in the school. It's and she said, I'm not saying it in any derogatory sense. It's kind of old fashioned still, and it's got that country feel to it, even though, like, we're 155 pupils now, which is, you know, grown.
You're obviously a passionate educator and a lifelong educator. What, sort of thinking back, we were talking about your childhood earlier, what about the years leading up to going to college? What sort of inspired you to get into teaching?
Well, strange in some respects. I always loved people, and I had a thing. My father had it too. He used to always say, he used to always say, "What goes round comes round." Always. I can remember as a very small child. I'll never forget it. My granny, who was his mother, who when she got older she went and lived with my aunt down in Middleton and Cork, but she used to send us money for our birthdays, and I can still see an orange 50 shilling note. It was a note, and it was a big note, and it came for my birthday, and I had it in my pocket. And my father used to go to the Friary Church for Mass on a Sunday morning, 6:00 it was, and then he would go up and play golf. And of course I'd be up at the crack of dawn, I'd be with him down at Mass. Now I was only 6 or 7, but I can remember going to the church with him. This particular morning was my birthday, and I had this coat on me, and when we came out they were collecting for the Vincent de Paul, and he had no change on him, but I had been taking this out during Mass and looking at it and playing with it and all the rest, and he said to me, put that in there. And I can still see the tears, big fat tears. I couldn't believe. And he said, "No, someone needs it more than you. You put that in there. We've enough." We weren't well off around, but we were just ordinary, But I remember parting with it. I never forget it. I can still feel the sensation, and coming home in the car, and him saying to me, he said, he used to have a few kind of sayings. He was a very deep kind of a man. He was a great thinker, and full of justice about society. Before, almost you would call it almost socialist, but not, but in a very measured way. But he used to say, he was saying to me, honestly, don't worry about that money. When you give something, you have to feel good about it. Someone needs that, and it'll come back to you tenfold. And about 3 weeks later, that same granny won money in the prize bands, and she sent me what she had won, and it was 350 shilling. I'll never forget it. It resonated with me forevermore. And as we grew up, then he used to say to us, education is no burden to carry. Be educated. He wanted us all to be educated, at that age. So I remember when I qualified in Carysford, and he came, I was out babysitting at the time, and he came, and at that time there was no mobile phones, no internet, no nothing, but your results would be, you could phone in for them, and he had phoned from his office in anyway, and he came over, and he was thrilled and he was delighted. And I finished off, and he came back and collected me and went off, and he said to me, "Now do remember one thing," he said, "when you go out into the world as a teacher," he said, "the more you have," and he said, "I'm not talking about money, but the more you have, the more you owe to society. You should always," and I never ever forgot it. And he used to say, there are some people, who don't have opportunities like you've had. We've put you through college, and you have that now, and you're going into a profession where you can really have a profound effect, positive effect on somebody. And he said, always remember that. And I often think of him, and think of even my own daughter now today. And I'd say to her, she is, and she's fully qualified and all that. And I'd say to her, don't forget, you have that qualification, and there's lots of people haven't, but you do owe it to society to pay back, not monetary, but in other ways you can pay it back. So I suppose I always had that bend for, I loved kids, but I can even remember in school with the nuns, even kind of getting into kind of arguments. I remember very, very well an incident. I'll never forget it. I was involved in debating, and there was a girl from Blackwater. She was of a family of 19, and her father was a postman, and they were poor people. And I remember we had got into the semi-finals of a debating thing, and she said, the teacher in the school said, you're going to the debate tonight, and you, and this particular girl, they had nothing, and our uniforms were bottle green and a white shirt, and she said, you can't go, because her shirt was kind of grey. From where? Worn at her. And anyway, I can still remember me saying, like, why isn't Tricia going? And she straight out, like, well, her shirt, you can't represent the school or whatever. Well, I said, I'm not going either. Then that's it. You can do what you like. I'm not going. And I would have been the first speaker at the debate, whatever, and the rounder up, the captain of the whatever, was murdered. But I stood my ground and I said, no, I'm not going. She's going. And she was really good, like, as apart from that. And I remember my father was actually on the board of management of the school, and someone rang him or whatever. But when I came home, he said to me, you did the right thing. I will be supporting you. And so it's I suppose you have a mindset, haven't you? And you're kind of brought up like that. And I suppose that's why I'm involved in kind of Vincent Paul. And then when I got, like, I didn't get into teaching, I didn't look to go teaching. I was really interested in social science. But at that stage, it wasn't considered a career, kind of. It what's that, social science, whatever. So I kind of ended up in teaching by accident. But from the day I can remember we went out in teaching practice, I just thought, this is heaven. I just can't believe all these little people in my life. All these little people that I'd be able to, like, see them every day, and the differences in them and their presentations and how every day is different and all the rest. And I just fell head over heels in love with it. And I would often say to people, teaching must be one of the most fabulous careers if you love it. It must be a nightmare if you, like any job. But like, what you do in very simple ways with kids can give them a perspective on life that can change their outlook on everything in life. And it doesn't have to be the biggies, it's just that small everyday meeting and greeting and that kind of thing. And and I suppose, so I always consider myself, when I was in Carysford, I was saying that to you, Seamus Heaney, the poet. Was I saying this to you, Chris? No, maybe I wasn't. He was a lecturer in UCD at that time. He wasn't famous as a poet. He was writing poetry, but he wasn't famous. So he was an English lecturer. But I remember him very, very clearly in the auditorium on our first day there, and he got up on the thing and he said, and his words were, you're after getting into Carysford, you're the cream of the crop, you've all done very well at your Leaving Cert, you wouldn't be here if you hadn't. And he said, and you're going into a very noble profession and respect it. And he said, remember, and I quote it often at staff meetings, or different things he'd be doing. He said, remember, you're going into a role where people are giving you their most prized possession, their child. Respect it. And even sometimes when things, when you could nearly be really cross with a kid, I always, in the back of my head, think, this is a precious possession of somebody's, and I treat it with respect. And I suppose that's the way I've kind of marched out my career, that it's whatever. But I mean, every day, I just love every single day of it. Every day is different, and every day you're seeing progress at the same time. There's things moving forward.
Speaking of sort of things being precious, and I know the previous occasion we actually spoke about the records of the school. What's your connection with the heritage of this area, with the school, with the town itself?
Yeah, I suppose my mother and father were both, and my grandparents, very much into antiquities, and that my mother has a business, an antique business. So we were always steeped in going to auctions, buying stuff, valuing stuff. So when I moved up to Rathdrum, from day one, I started collecting anything local that was published. I collected it, I bought it, and I have it. So I have a couple of shelves now of just pamphlets, books, just pieces, local place names and all that. So I would have a real love of kind of where it came from, what it was made of. Not just Rathdrum, but the whole area, And I have a husband who's all into the Ice Age and glaciers and all that, so the valleys and all that. That's his big thing. When we would go anywhere, if we were going over the gap or whatever, we'd always pull in and have a look, and he'd go, can you imagine that many million years ago blah 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 blah. So he has all that scientific, geographical end of things, whereas mine is probably more romanticised, to be honest. And I suppose when I look at Rathdrum and the streetscape, I often park the car and just look up and down the street. It's beautiful. It's the building, and I can imagine him in my mind's eye where, like, the way the roads was different. You know, the road came through in the different way, and that people were on their way, and of course the Wooden Bridge Hotel. Then people were stopping there. That was a main stopping post. But how? Not that long even before I came here, like back in the 60s and the 70s, how remote, really remote the whole area is. And then when you look at it, built up on, you know, the side of a hill, right up on the top. And like, I think I remember being horrified at the impact of the snow. When we got snow in Wexford, you just got a little scatter on the ground. Then when I came here, and you'd be drifts of snow because we're so high up, you know. But it was one of the things, like, when I came out of mainstream teaching, that I really missed, because I used to love doing the local history projects with them and all that. The river, you know, like the Avonmore, and then like even the history, if you take of Avondale itself. But I would have always every year done with the kids kind of shops, the streets, what has changed over the years. When I came to Rathdrum, there was this, that and the other. Now all these years later, there's this, that and the other, you know, and how, yeah, even that element of the town has changed and adapted and moved on. And, you know, I mean, and I suppose I'm never anti-change. You miss some things that were here, but everything is sort of development, and you have to move with the times too, don't you? I love the whole thing of the square down there. I love if it was car free, and don't mind me now, if it was car free. Not answering that. No. I'd love if it was car free, and just something made, because it's beautiful. The buildings on each side of it, you know, like Pierce's, that was like, I would know the history of most of the and I would have done that with the kids, like the Cartoon Inn. That was a pub, and there was a grocery and a coffin shed down the back. That's why it's called the coffin shed, because that's where Cullens and Paddy Cullen used to make the coffins. And then the one on the right hand side where the Centre supermarket comes up to it, then that was Lawrence Pierce. He was the wool merchant here, and he had the place, you know, he used to buy the wool in, and there was a grocery and a bar and all that. And then Morgan Mackey's up at the back of it, the railway bar over there. And huge history in the town, huge history. You know, the churches are beautiful, and particularly the Catholic Church is, people come from all over to look at, you know, when I go to Mass, actually, I often just sit up there and I count the blocks. Do you know, I count and look at the ceiling and how they did it, and the columns and the rocks and all that were brought from the river. Can you imagine? There's the river down there, and they were rolled up on, you know, timber, all the way up to the church. Unbelievable. And that church was 150 years old about 10 years ago. Oh, incredible.
Would you have any, maybe, yeah, like you mentioned the Avonmore as well, like would you have any particular favourite elements of the local heritage or local folklore or local natural heritage?
I suppose, Avondale. I mean, you know, it's on my doorstep and it's there, and my kids were reared in it, and they think it's their back garden, and, you know, and when I be down there, Charles Stewart, and you won't be thinking, so the historical thing, but also I suppose my husband's very much into trees and native trees, and kind of the Mount Ushery type stuff as well, and stuff brought in. We had celebrations in our house the other day. He planted a tree about 25 years ago, the handkerchief tree, which is most unusual, and for the first time ever, about 3 weeks ago, we had our first handkerchiefs on it. Yeah. And he wouldn't be into flowers or anything like that, but all that kind of stuff, you know. So I mean, I suppose we're so used to the like oftentimes when I'd be down in Avondale, down at the river and that, it's gorgeous, like it's a world of its own. But I'm nearly immune to. I appreciate it, but we're so used to it being on our doorstep that, and then I think, oh, that's why people are driving here. You know, we have it every day. Yeah, and I think what they've done now, the development of it has been good. And it's you have to go with the times, and it's very, very discreet. The whole new tower thing. It's lovely. It's really, really nice, and it's empathetic.
If a tourist was coming to the town and they had a day to spend, what would you recommend they go and see?
Well, certainly Avondale. Claravale is beautiful. Claravale is like, it's a piece of serenity, just sitting on its own. And the walk out to Claravale, and you could go the loop walk out and then extend out to it, and it's lovely. And there is a walk, I haven't done it, there is a walk from Claravale to heading Lara way, and I believe it is gorgeous. But I mean, there's a whole load of features out there, like you have the river, then you have the forest, and even the roads out there, the country road. I mean, if you diverged from, if you came away from the banks of the river and up into it, windy country roads and big forestations on one side, and the wildlife and everything. When I have a friend lives out in Claravale, and when you get out of the car, you never heard anything like all the noises. There's just things everywhere, woodpeckers, everything. You can just hear it all around, And even I know down in my own house, I have a nephew living in Greystones, and when he comes down, he said, "Do you mind if I open the back door?" And he listens, because all the noises, and we're so used to it. Like, we have pheasants and cock pheasants wandering around our garden, up at our back door looking for food, and birds chirping all day long and all that. And it is, it's Avondale, and it's, it is biodiversity and all that, and most certainly.
Would there be any perhaps like folk beliefs about those animals, maybe in the past, or anything that's still remembered? Would people believe things about seeing certain birds, or?
You would. Yeah, I'd be like that myself, actually, about cats and ladders and everything. I would be, and flipping magpies. I hate them. But
what would you believe about the magpies?
No, I would. One for sorrow, two for joy. I don't go any further than that, but I have to see two, and if I saw one, I'd have to salute it. I would just have to do that, definitely. But or like the robin coming into your house, and we'd often get birds in our house because of where we are, and our back door would be open all the time, so birds do fly in. Yeah, but there'd be, I can't bear, like, I often think of deer, I can't stand now, and Martin is the same, like, out shooting, and I don't care what it is, pheasants, any of them, deer, but I can't bear to think of them, being like that. And that is kind of traditional here as well, and you have to respect that. People have their licenses to shoot X amount, and they do it. And they do eat, we'd have kids in here and say, do you not like venison? I'd eat, but I know. I'm trying to think now of when we actually bought our house in Avondale, a neighbour up the road of farmers, they had the most beautiful peacock. I'd never seen a peacock so close. And would be standing outside the gate with a full fan out every day, just strutting along, that kind of way. But straight across the road from my house, there's cattle, and you'd hear them then when they're hungry, moving closer down to us and that. But you're very in commune with nature. It's all part and parcel. We think nothing of it, just as part of life, the rural part of life, isn't it?
And your parents obviously had worked in antiquities. Did they sort of try and instill a kind of a love for that sort of like kind of that personal heritage with you, or did they involve you in any of that?
Yeah, I mean, from a very young age we were just always exposed to, and my grandfather was a great fixer. Now, my mother's father, and he had a garage down in Ross. I can still see it, the garage, the shed, whatever, and he could fix everything. Didn't matter what happened. We used to bring our dolls out when they'd be the leg would be broke off them or whatever, and you'd bring them out, and he said, back in the dolls' hospital, Now, he could never fix the leg, but he'd have it wrapped up in a bandage and give it back to you, and sure, it was as good as new to us. But he was always fixing things. But him and my granny used to go to auctions, which were a bit unusual. Now I'm talking about back in the 70s. And would be buying up nice furniture, you know, Edwardian and Victorian chairs. I can remember nice dining chairs and different bits, and very tasty. My grandmother in particular was very tasty. And I remember as a young child I'd been given a few bob, and you were able to buy, I remember buying a chair and then teaching you how to French polish and teaching you how to upholster in a kind of a simple sort of a way, and always looking back to see it, what was used then and what was used now. And I would say my mother and my grandfather, before they even hear the word recycling, they were doing that. But people then, if you had a tin of biscuits, the tin became the sewing box. And my mother would still be like that. She wouldn't, throw away nothing. Like, everything has a use and a reuse, and that would have been instilled in us. And I have kind of over the years, because of my involvement with kids, I suppose, I collected a lot of kids' toys. So I have a huge, I started off with a little bag. Now I have 3 big sacks full. So every year I bring them in here, and the kids just are mesmerised by them. Even down to simple things like Buckaroo, and I have a doll that her hair grew out at the top of her head, Sheena. I got her for Christmas when I was about 7. That's a long time ago now. And the simple little thing, yo-yos, that they don't have now. But yeah, certainly my parents we would have just been in a house where it was like osmosis, that you always look back, the past was as important as the future. Yeah. Mm-hmm. With regards to antiquities and collecting stuff, and yeah, books. I remember at Christmas time we used to always get a lovely book each, but my mother used to buy us Richard Scarry. You probably never heard of him now. He's probably Richard Scarry books, and he was the first of the people who did these kind of lovely illustrative, the book. I can still remember one, and I think it was called The Big Red Bus, and it was like that size of a book in hardback. And we read it till it was threadbare, but it had loads of things going on this page, a street in London, and lots of things, those kind of things. So we would have had lots of time spent, that sort of a way. I suppose enriching your lives in a different way, long ever before any of the screens came.
You mentioned as well there the sort of the reuse of objects and that kind of attitude towards like sort of recycling that maybe was a
given at that
stage. Was it similar like that in Rathdrum when you moved here, and because you mentioned how tight-knit the community was? What was the community like in terms of reciprocity and working with each other?
Oh yeah, like there's a great unity, and you'd see it, I suppose, poignant at times, in the sense that if there was any kind of tragedy or it, people just, without even thinking about it, deaths or difficulties, which I wouldn't have seen in Wexford because of the spread of people. But here, like if there was a death, the whole town would be concentrated on that, and then there'd be tea out in the complex, and looking after each other, very, very much so like that. And in happy and in sad occasions. And I remember one time, I can't remember what, I couldn't believe it. When someone would be getting married in the church, right? And people wouldn't be invited, but all the local people used to go down to the church. Now, I never saw that in Wexford. So in other words, Mary Murphy was getting married, and she'd get married at 2:00. Well, all the guests would be there, but there'd be a whole band of other women all down to look at the wedding. I never saw that in my life before, ever. Real old-fashioned now that is, and you'd still get a little bit of that today. And that you would notice it as well at communion and confirmation, that we'd have all the people in for those services, but we'd have a certain cohort of people that come, because it is communion and confirmation, and it's a parish celebration, and still, regardless of what has happened with the church, and I respect the church, and I respect. We've had a fabulous, we have an amazing priest here currently, Father Derek, and he's just he's just a man. He's a fabulous man, and the church is still very central to Rathdrum. It is. It's a very important part of the parish. Now, people may not be practising as much and whatever, but it has never lost that respect, whereas in big towns wouldn't even know who the priest was. But everyone here would know what time Mass is at and who the priest is and all those kind of things, do you know? And that's still the rural way of living.
What about sort of festivals? You mentioned the Cartoon Inn, and what about festivals that happen in times past in
I can remember there was always big, huge, massive, gigantic in the summer sports day. Huge. And you know the fair green outside the school? It used to happen there. There was whatever. Now, preceding my time, there was always a market in the square in Rathdrum. And that was animals and everything, but that was before my time. I think that was kind of 50s into the 60s. Now, into the 60s and, you know, even into the 70s, kind of, wasn't that long gone when I came. Then you had the man living next door to the school was a man called Terry Willers. You probably never heard of him. He was a cartoonist with Hall's Pictorial Weekly. You probably never heard of that either. And he worked for the Independent as well. And he had been at the Cannes Film Festival. Now, he was renowned, Terry Willers. If you Google him, you'll see he did all these leprechauns and all that kind of thing. And he started up and ran successfully in the 80s an international cartoon festival. You wouldn't get in on a bank holiday weekend. It was done on the June bank holiday weekend. And all the schools were taken over with workshops all over the place, and that it was absolutely amazing. But they would still do the Corpus Christi procession here, and it's done up in Green Anne. When I came here, it was always done. Patrick's Day Parade, and even when Rathdrum was small, it was on, and everyone was expected to come out. You know, everybody like Scouts, GA, schools, and represent and be part of the day. Well, there was always a mayor's campaign in Rathdrum, and there's such fun, you know. Let me see what else. What other celebrations or biggies? Yeah, I mean, when I came to Rathdrum first, out in the sports complex and in the RDA hall, that's a hall over there, the Rathdrum Development Association, there was bands like, there was Brendan Boyer and, you know, country. I can remember Brendan Grace, the comedian, being here and that kind of thing. I suppose in rural areas at that time, that's what happened. Then it was the big, and everyone would be out at it, you know. I suppose no more the church being central, also here the GA would be central, very central. Of all the sporting organisations, it would be the one that would be central, and that they would have had activities that were central and very much part of the community.
Mm-hmm. And you've mentioned you worked with St Vincent de Paul. What about your own relationship with that? Have you worked with community organisations yourself? What sort of...
I mainly, I would have been involved in a few different things. I would have been involved with a bit of counselling, adult literacy, senior citizens and all the rest. But for the past 10-15 years, it's Vincent de Paul that I'm involved with. I would have done a fair bit of training with them, given training in that, and I would have been involved in kind of the education part of it at a different level, kind of promoting support for people to access more education, to see can you kind of break the cycle of poverty and that, you know. But it's a fabulous organisation. It's really profound, the effect that it can have on people, and it's so discreet and low key and all those things, and I would still be deeply involved in it, you know, locally and otherwise.
Mm-hmm. What do you think are the challenges that are ahead of Rathdrum in the years to come?
I hope that the charm of the place is still maintained, and that the geographical landscape is enhanced rather than, and I'm not talking about building a little out in the corner, that's not it. it's that I suppose that I would hope that these communities of people where it's lovely, you drive up in Tanny these days and there's loads and loads of houses, and I hope that they get to be part of what's here, but also almost it's like an opportunity for Atrum to, it's like a flower kind of, and open up the petals and be part of it, and yet you have your lovely community bit here and here and here, and then there's a merger that it comes back into Rathdrum again, because like it is like, I would consider it as a village when I came to it. It is now a town, and the heart of it is its people, really. And that street, that main street, like it's like one artery, and it's quite small when you actually look at it, you know. And you have that road on out to Glendalough, and the other one on to Wicklow, on to Archaeological. They're going or whatever, and then out that way they're going, who knows where they're going to end up. But in itself, like, there's a great heart here, and I think that the development of the memorial park down there has been, like when I think that years and years ago, that was barren fields, that was owned by the Mercy Order, and then they bequeathed it to the Rathdrum Development Association, who then didn't do a whole lot, but they did it lovely. You know, it's just very, very simple, and I hope that whole it's central to the town, I feel, and that and the square and your local shops, and by all means other little shops popping up to service the needs. And probably in time to come, like over here in the RDA hall, it might look low key, but there's plenty going on in it. There's yoga classes, there's Irish dancing, there's ballet, there's bingo. There's, if we have any spillover from here, no problem, over to the RDA hall. So it's a great facility that's kind of undervalued. You know, it offers much more than people recognise it for. I hope that, I mean, sometimes landscapes have to change to accommodate, and you have to be realistic about it. I heard people talking about like a road to take traffic from here to there, and that's fine as long as it's done sympathetically, that it doesn't, because the look of the town is very attractive, and the buildings, and even when I look up here at our school, you know, it's iconic, really. It's a real 1940s, it's a school, you don't have to ask what it is, rather than those purpose-built big glass edifices that are heartless and they're all the same inside and whatever. Where this is kind of itself, you know. So I just hope that certainly with the number of people that are, it's about 25 years ago since we call them Woodbine Grove and Woodbine Avenue were built. Those people moved in. There was only maybe 8 houses and 10 houses. So that was only, you know, it was a small number. Then the Woods was built, right? And that came in at the Celtic Tiger time. That's about, say 15, 16 years ago, people started moving into it. And still at that time, a lot of people didn't send their kids to school. They continued on because their child they bought them because they couldn't afford a house anywhere else further up, and their families were up towards Dublin, so they were bringing their children up and down and their kids or whatever. Now I notice more and more people, I was talking even to one mum there recently, and she was saying, we're just so happy I think we picked the right place, like, and we have a little fella and another 2 little boys in school, and she's working from home, and the dad is working also, and she said, I just love it. I love when you go into the post office and they know you, and the shop and that kind of thing. And there's a certain cohort of people who really get into that, and then there's others that it doesn't matter where they live, they might as well be living anywhere. They're never going to, they live here, but they'll just live their own lives. But you'd be hoping that there'd be enough of the ones that want to become involved and expand out. Like when we got the children of the Indian nurses, right? Suddenly cricket started out in Avondale. They just put down a concrete slab, and now there's a cricket game there every Sunday, and they go training. And that's what you want to see. Some of these new people that moved in, like as my father used to say, I think you've got your head. That means you're so open it up to them, and they have things to offer as well. And I wouldn't like to think that just because the likes of me has been here for this length of time, or other people that are indigenous to. I mean, I'll always be an outsider to here, despite the fact that I'm here 40 years, but I'm not from here. So, you'll have that. But that these people that come in, that they're embraced to come in, to open it up, and whatever facilities come because of them, it's because there's a need, rather than, I can't stand when I hear them saying we should have a little now out in the thing, out of whatever. Maybe in some time, but let it evolve. I know some people would say, when they build places like Adamstown in Dublin, you put in all the infrastructure and da. I would sooner see what happened, even though everyone mightn't agree with traffic and everything. What has happened has happened. The houses have been built, people need them, and they come in. And now as needs change, like there's a new barber shop opened up here. There's never been a barber's in Rattle. There've been 3 hairdressers, never a barber's. Now, why is there a barber's? Obviously someone has, and apparently couldn't get in through the door on Saturday. So that's lovely. I think that's really, really lovely. And little by little other things will open up that'll make a difference, and it'll develop and evolve. I don't know, it'll always just be a town. It'll be a town, and maybe an ever increasing town. Maybe there'll be new schools, maybe there'll be other bits and pieces, but I hope it does retain its character and yet embrace what's coming in.
It's very interesting. Might sort of come back to that towards the end. I've got an interesting question actually. You mentioned spending time in Carlow, and your father worked sort of in the Midlands, some of the Midlands areas, within the county of Wexford, but looking further west. Did you ever have a sort of relationship or an experience with the Black Stairs?
Yeah, well, on our way to Carlow, the Black Stairs used to be there. We'd say we'd get over the mountain, then we'd be there, and when we were coming back, we'd get over the mountain, we'd be back in Wexford. That's our only interest in the Black Stairs. You know what I mean? That would have been kind of like, where we would have loved en route was like Bunclody and that. Oh, that beautiful, absolutely. Some gorgeous gardens up around Bunclody. But say, I suppose my own connection in Wexford would have been more, you see, towards the coast where my grandparents and that were from. And the only connection we had with Carlow was because my father had a business up there. So in a nutshell, no, not really. No. Fort Mountain, but not Black Stairs. I mean, I'd know about it, but I wouldn't.
And having obviously lived now in the mountains for a long time, what would you say the big sort of cultural divide is between coastal communities or cultural differences between coastal and mountain communities?
Yeah, well, I suppose because my experience is Wexford, I would always say that Wexford, somehow by living on the coast, in my head, I always feel that it almost gives you more opportunities. There's no constraint when you have that. I would always look at Wexford and say to myself, Wexford is like an independent banana republic. They do not care what they're doing in Dublin. They don't give a hoot. They don't care what they're doing in Waterford. They don't care what they're doing in Wicklow, because down here this is what we're doing. Very independent, now maybe that's bias, but there's so many facets to Wexford. You have coming down the Dublin coast, it's quite Dublinised, and you come around the bottom of it, now you're out to Hook Head and all that, and it becomes, it's a different territory altogether. Then you have all the inland part, like Enniscorthy and places like that. It's all, and then touching off those counties, then like when you go to New Ross, then you're hitting into Kilkenny, you're starting to get into that, so it touches an awful lot. But I always feel Wexford is exceedingly independent, whereas say Wicklow is, sorry, it's not part of Dublin. That's the way I feel about, that Wicklow's kind of saying, well, we're the next best thing now to Dublin, so we're nearly there. But, and then, funny, I wouldn't have any desire to live in Wicklow or Arklow. I like them. I doctor, dentist, shopping, do all that there, and I'd be, hop in and out. But I wouldn't have naturally that same desire that I would. I mean, I think that if you were to pick an inland spot, and I suppose I'm biased now because of here, I think I landed in a school where, at a time where the staff were older, they were hitting retirement. When I came here, I was like, them calves you see coming out of the barn after the winter. Like, I was like a wild I had such freedom career-wise to do what you know, the enthusiasm of youth coupled with the fact that I was in a school where there was no stifling on me at all. I could just be me and get out there and all the rest. And I just think it made all the difference. I don't think you could ever have that opportunity. I could have ever personally had that opportunity anywhere else. And then to land in a place where, and I suppose through school really, and then through other bits and pieces, that, I mean, there wouldn't be anyone I wouldn't know here. You'd know everyone. Now the new people, I know they're new people because I know I don't know them, so they're definitely new. I don't know, but I mean, if I went into Rastrum, my kids used to say, "No, Mommy, don't, because if you go in, you're not going to be." I could be 3 hours gone, just meeting this one, that one, the other one, chattering, and a very easy. I would consider it, the pace of life in Rastrum is at a different level to elsewhere. It's still rural, it's slower, it's not as affected by the outside world, and yet it's not so tight that it's not influenced by the outside world, but there's still an innate kind of old-fashionedness. Like funerals here are just huge. They're just huge. They're very much, there's a huge respect for older people, and a respect for the way things were and what was usually done. I have to laugh, when you go to Mass, you have your own seat in Mass. So if you're not there, you're missed. And if you are there, you don't get into the wrong seat, you'd be kind of, what are you doing there? That old-fashioned way of doing it, and it still exists.
Sort of a few more questions perhaps. Where do you see the role of tourism in all of that then, sort of in the present and in the future?
I think that kind of, say, in some respects, there's a difficulty for Rathdrum in the sense that we're sandwiched in between Glendalough. Now I'm not saying that in a bad way, Glendalough is beautiful. You don't have to be in the tourist board to promote Glendalough. It's just, that's it. Glendalough is Glendalough. And so you kind of have people, particularly, and even Irish people who come, if they're coming over this side, where do they have to go? Well, they're going to the Guinness Hop Store, and they're going to Trinity College, and they're going to Glendalough. So Rathdrum, I think how in the future what I would see is it to retain its quaintness and retain that old-fashioned kind of colloquial country slow pace of life, not to become somewhere like the Greystones of the world that has overrun with everything, the marina and all that kind of thing. It's a whole, retain its quaintness and its ruralness, and I think people that move in, that's what kind of they find attractive about it. They're not looking for Costa to be parked in the square. They just want to go into centre and get your mug of coffee, sure, it'll do you. But I think with tourism, I think I think because we're of an era of this biodiversity and other, you couldn't get anything more pure than what's here. 500 acres of untouched land out in Avondale, and then you take it from here all the way out to Lara, just nothing, only rivers, and it's heaven. Then go that way and go up to Glenmalure, and sure, every time I go up to Glenmalure I see something different. Every time I go on the Gap, I put in and go, oh my God, look at that. It's there's something for everybody. So I suppose for the person who and you don't have to be this big professional hiker or cyclist or anything like that, but for families, it's really, go up there to that place where you went, to the river, or where you went. Sure, so simple. There's a little spot on the way up to Glenmalure, in on the left hand side. I can't remember what we used to call it, but that's where I brought my kids swimming all the days of their life. It's just a little hole, beautiful water. I used to sit there and swim. That's where they swam every single day during the summer. We'd go up there with a few more and swim. But it's that simplicity. I think that it's an area for enthusiasts, like your cyclists and those sort of people, and your serious walkers, but it's also family orientated, you know, that kind of glamping, camping, not looking for the hurdy-gurdy, just looking for the quieter life, kind of. And I think that more and more with the fast pace of life, that's the kind of holidays people will look for, isn't it? And then it's readiness and closeness. You can dip in and dip out. I think it's a balance, isn't it, that people kind of is nice, you know. If you want Disney, go to Paris. Go. Come back. I always say to my kids at home, what do I want? Do I want a plane ticket to... No. And I would always say, all I want is just in my... Because it's so peaceful even out where I'm living. Do you know what I mean? It's peaceful. There's quiet. There's the forest. It's lovely.
But is there anything that... before I ask the last question or two, anything that we haven't discussed that you'd like to, particularly about your own life, or anything that...
Let me see what I wrote.
Yeah.
Let me just see, little things. No, different little things. I only wrote a few.
So anything at all, it's a total freedom.
What did I say? Yeah, the way... I was just looking at leisure, and it's funny, kind of say, even with tourism, like leisure, and it's still the same things that we did as kids if you actually drill down to it, like swimming in the sea. Do you know, Wexford people they didn't know what swimming pools were. You were brought there when you could swim in the sea to make sure you could swim, and then you were let back out into the sea, you know. Yeah, like cycling, go-kart and sewing and knitting, and those traditions are still very much here. Library. The library was a big thing for us in Wexford. It's a big thing here now. Fabulous new library down there. Cards. I would teach the kids cards here, you know, card games. And the different games. I play all the old games, but we used to play like Curbsy, Elastics, Rounders, Red Rover, Tag, Bubbles, Marbles, you know, that kind of thing. You had your gang, building your forts. I just was scribbling things out.
Yeah. Perhaps you could tell me more about those sort of pastimes then, and how they've changed. You know, you mentioned the knitting and sewing, and also the cards and rounders. How have they changed?
I think that there's still a cohort of people here. There's enough people here that still value those traditions, because unfortunately screen time I always say to the kids here, it's such an asset, but it's a destroyer. Because my grandfather used to say, everything in moderation, including moderation. Everything. And it is true. So it's the fact that it's they're handing phones to babies in buggies, and I've seen it, like myself. I've seen people just handing in a phone, and the baby's hardly able to, and straight away. Sure, of course it's attractive. I know it myself. If you went on your phone, it is an attractive activity to be at, but kids can't regulate like that. But I think that schools are central to kind of reigniting for kids that. I would say to them here often, on a Friday afternoon, there's no waste in teaching a game. I used to do that when I was in the classroom. I used to say to myself, I used to teach them how to play cards, 45, 25. All those kind of simple games, and I would take out the board games and teach them how to play Lego or Ludo, teach them how to play what else used to I play with them, like traffic lights, stickball, lines, marbles. Used to collect marbles, jacks. Do you remember the jacks on your hand? You put your things or whatever. And I would often talk to them here about, like, do you have a gang? And gangs nowadays have a different connotation. I'd say, when I was a kid, I'd be telling them we used to have a fort. We used to build a fort, like, out of nothing. And then we'd have your gang, and you have to do tests then to get into the gang, and then to stay in the gang, and all that. All innocent. Like, could you climb that tree right up? Could you cycle 10 times around the estate? Do you know, things like simple little things like that? But I think that and that's what kids actually love. They really, very little would take them off their screens,
Actually, I had a question. You mentioned moving here, and you bought the place with your husband. Did you come down together from Dublin, or
No.
did you meet him here?
We met here because he came as a student to the chemical factory,
Right.
and I came then from Carysford, And I started in September. He started the June before me on 6-month placement. Then he was made permanent. I was permanent, and then we met. And met in the Wooden Bridge Hotel, actually. Yeah, strange, isn't it? And then we got married in 1989, and as I say, we paid 30,500 for our house in 1989. 30,500. 4-bedroom on an acre on the Avondale estate. Like, it's bizarre now, when you think of it today. But how times have changed, Yeah. It's a lifetime ago.
Exactly, yeah. Perhaps I might finish with one last question then, unless there's anything else that's on the top of your mind. What does it mean to you to live in this area, if you could sum it up in...
I suppose, like, I go up and down to Wexford a lot and everything, right? But I suppose Rathdrum now, well, first of all, it's my home. When my children were small, when they were quite tiny, the two of them in the back of the car, I can remember when I would come, we call it the new bridge in Wexford. It was actually the old bridge, but it was the new bridge when I was a child. So that's coming in Castle Bridge. I don't know if you know that. I don't go down. I cannot drive down that main road and go on. I have to turn off in Ballycanoe, go down Ballyedmond, Ballycanoe, Castle Bridge, and in over the bridge in Wexford. And when I would come and see the water on the bridge there, and I can still see my two sitting in the back, and I'd say, oh, thank God, home sweet home. And I remember coming back one day on a Sunday night, and the two of them were in the car, and my eldest might have been about 6 and then 2. And the eldest lassie said to me, she said, now Mum, there's one thing I want you to do. You're to stop saying home sweet home, because we love Wexford, but this is not our home. Our home is Wicklow. And it was a real wake-up call, it was a real... And in my head I'd always sort of thought, when I came here, I'll do a year, and then, things change and you kind of... or whatever. And I have absolutely no regrets about being here. And, I've met the nicest of people. I've had a wonderful career. I've lovely friends. I'm accessible to Wexford. I'm accessible to wherever I want to go. But I think more than anything else, what I've loved about it, I suppose school is a huge part, but the community of Rathdrum, it's very tranquil. It's you sort of, and I'm not saying this in any kind of a derogatory fashion, but when I come out of Archaeological or Wicklow or come back, whatever, it's a little bit of a step back in time. It's the pace of life is gentle. And that's what I would say about Rathdrum. It's a very homely, and if you, I was always myself here. Now my husband would be quieter and kind of whatever, but at the same time he would be very happy as well. But I always met people where they were at. I was always just me, and so therefore we kind of became part of the community. And I suppose with working here it made it that little bit easier. And as I said to you before, it never infringed on because people would say to you, how can you teach and live in I reared my 2 children here as well, and there's something very peaceful and a little bit set back in time, and you're not in that hubbub of built up. I think it's the tranquility and the landscape and the river and the trees and you're in the country. A small little turn takes you out into a little boreen, and you're slap bang in the middle of the country, and yet you're near everything. You're not. When I used to go home to Wexford, they used to say to me, oh God help you, how are they all up there? As if they were and I'd say to them, I don't know what you're talking about, like, we're not that. And now they consider me to be part of the, oh God help you, how are you getting on up there? That if we're, as if it was really old fashioned and nearly closed down, that kind of way. Whereas it's vibrant. It is really vibrant. Like, Rathdrum is vibrant, and it's alive, and it's developing in a nice way. I hope.
Great. Well, I think, again, if there's nothing else that you want to add, feel free to. I think we might wrap it up there. Thanks very much, Aideen.
You're very welcome.
It's lovely to chat to you. And
I hope it did something for you.
oh no, wonderful! It's wonderful to hear about all these stories and early life and moving here and all that. So it's great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.